Hi, this is Steve Adler and you're watching Art, Science and Truth. In this episode, I'll talk about the big question of evolution of life. The vast variety and variability of life forms on Earth makes the richness of nature obvious. But, how did this great biological diversity of life appear on Earth? Was it by the process and mechanisms of evolution? Or is there maybe some other explanation? When we hear the word evolution, most of us probably immediately think Charles Darwin, and him as the founder of theory of evolution. But, did you know that Darwin's theory has its roots in the ancient past? The idea of evolution was formulated long before Darwin. Some ancient Greek philosophers, like Anaximander and Empedocles, proposed their own evolutionary theories that have some resemblance to the later theories. For example, article on Britannica website states about the ancient philosopher. Anaximander held an evolutionary view of living things. The first creatures originated from the moist element by evaporation. Man originated from some other kind of animal, such as fish. This clearly has some similarity with Darwin's theory, although it's not exactly the same. Nevertheless, this is valuable background information, because it places the roots of theory of evolution in ancient philosophy. Thus, it is reasonable to ask, what is theory's real standing as a scientific theory today? Is the theory of evolution backed by modern science? What are its weak points? And what are its strengths? These kind of questions require an answer. First, we have to define what we actually mean by the theory of evolution. There are basically two main aspects of it. First, all life forms come from a common ancestor. This is sometimes called a tree of life. Second, evolution's creative power is based on natural mechanisms. Several mechanisms have been proposed, but the most well-known ones are the mechanism of natural selection and the mechanism of genetic mutation. These mechanisms working together is basically assumed to be the cause behind the appearance of the great variety of life forms on Earth. Because evolution's creative ability is supposedly based on these two mechanisms, let's put them under the microscope and investigate them further. The concept of tree of life, or common ancestor, we can leave for another time. The question of mechanism of evolution is more important. Because without mechanism, nothing happens. Let's begin with natural selection. Natural selection is a rather simple concept. Simply put, it means the survival of the fittest. Here's a simple explanation. There's two populations of mice: white mice and dark mice. And there's also a fox as an enemy of all mice. In the beginning, white mice population is greater than dark mice population. Then some mice are eaten by the fox. White mice are more visible to the fox. Thus, white mice are eaten more. Then, the surviving mice reproduce. Next generation of mice contains higher number of dark mice. This is basically how natural selection works. And it's rather obvious fact in nature. But, to which extent natural selection actually explains the evolution? Well, it explains very little. That's why the Darwin's original theory was later extended to include another mechanism also. The mechanism of random genetic mutation. Thus, the modern theory of evolution is sometimes called Neo-Darwinian evolution theory. It's an update of the old obviously insufficient theory. But how does the mechanism of random genetic mutation work? And how does it cause evolution? Let's find out. A gene mutation is a permanent alteration in the DNA sequence that makes up a gene. Simply put, it means a change in the DNA. But how these changes in the DNA cause evolution? Suzanne Clancy describes in Nature Education. Beyond the individual level, perhaps the most dramatic effect of mutation relates to its role in evolution. Indeed, without mutation, evolution would not be possible. This is because mutations provide the raw material upon which the mechanisms of natural selection can act. By way of this process, those mutations that furnish individual organisms with characteristics better adapted to changing environmental conditions are passed on to offspring at an increased rate, thereby influencing the future of the species. So, if we go back to the story about the fox and the mice, the color of the mice is caused by a particular gene. Let's suppose that there were originally only white mice. But then a mutation occurred, and a dark mouse was born. Because of its dark color, the mouse could better adapt to its environment. In other words, it was better equipped to survive the fox. Then, the dark mouse reproduced and passed on the dark gene to his offspring. Thus, eventually the population of dark mice was born. Because of dark genes' adaptive benefit, the dark mice became prevalent. Now, let's assume that someone in the dark mice population had yet another beneficial mutation, and he passed this mutation to his offspring. Eventually, a new type dark mice became prevalent. This cycle repeated itself, until finally, a new species was formed. This is how evolution is supposed to work, in a nutshell. I do simplify things a bit, but this is sufficient at this point to explain the basic idea of how evolution works. Mutations do explain evolution, but only partially. Scientists have only been able to confirm a limited change, or variation in species, caused by the currently known mechanisms of evolution. Thus, some have called this empirically observed evolution a microevolution. The term refers to variation within certain limits. Microevolution cannot create totally new types of life forms out of existing ones. An example of this would be famous Darwin's finches. An observed variation in beak sizes of the finches. Another good example is antibiotic resistance of bacteria. Bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotic medicine. In both cases, nothing truly new is being created. Besides, according to scientific studies, adaptive evolutionary changes happen by breaking the genes, not creating new genes. One more important thing that needs to be emphasized before we continue. The evolution as described here is ultimately a random and unguided process. No purpose or any type of intelligent influence is allowed in the textbook theory of evolution. Thus, it has been proposed many times by scientists working on the field that the current theory needs yet another update. Consider this. In 2016, Royal Society meeting was held in London. The theme of this 3-day conference was New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. The significance of this meeting is highlighted by the fact that the Royal Society is arguably the world's most noble scientific body. Its founders included Robert Boyle, and it was later headed by no other than Isaac Newton himself. One of the speakers at this Royal Society conference was world-class biologist, Austrian evolutionary theorist Gerd Müller. In his talk, Müller discussed several of the fundamental, explanatory deficits of the textbook, Neo-Darwinian theory. According to Müller, the yet unsolved problems include those of explaining the origin of the anatomical and structural features of living creatures. Things like eyes, ears, and body plans. The origin of new forms throughout the history of life. For example, the mammalian radiation, some 66 million years ago, in which the major orders of mammals enter the fossil record. Or even more dramatically, the Cambrian explosion, in which the most animal body plans appear more or less without antecedents. And finally, non-gradual forms of transition, where you see abrupt discontinuities in the fossil record between different types. In other words, the neo-Darwinian mechanisms of mutation and natural selection lacks the creative power to generate the novel anatomical traits and all forms of life that have arisen during the history of life. Yet, neo-Darwinian theory continues to be presented to the public as the truth of how new living forms arose. The ultimate question about evolution is the origin of biological information. In the first episode of Art, Science and Truth, we discussed how the DNA contains real functional information. Information that can be compared to computer program or human language. What we currently know about the mechanisms of evolution is that they only work on already existing genetic information. Currently known evolutionary mechanisms lack real creative power. To create a big-scale changes needed to bring forth a vast variety of life forms, it would require adding of new genetic information. To transform one type of life form or animal into totally new type of animal requires great deal of new information. Think about it like this. You have a blueprint for building a bicycle. You also have all the materials and tools readily available that are needed to build a functioning bicycle. Now, assuming that you also have skills required for the task, you can build a bicycle without any serious difficulty. But, after building the bicycle, you want to have an evolved version of it. You want to evolve your bicycle into a motorcycle. Even if you had all the parts and materials available, you couldn't do the job without new set of building instructions. What do you think? Could you evolve the new instructions by randomly mutating the already existing instructions? Could you evolve the blueprint of a bicycle into a blueprint of a motorcycle by randomly changing the blueprint? The blueprint of the bicycle and the blueprint of the motorcycle may have some similarities, but obviously they are quite different, because a motorcycle is a more complex vehicle. The blueprint of the motorcycle contains different information. The mere fact that motorcycle requires more materials and mechanical parts demands more information. And not just more, but new also. Another way to think about the difficulty in creating something new and functional through a random, unguided process is to think about how well random change would work in creating a new and better computer program. For example, what do you think? Did Microsoft Windows Operating System 1.0 evolve into Microsoft Windows 10 operating system through a series of random changes? Of course not. It is no wonder that biologist James Shapiro has suggested the non-random nature of many mutational processes. The evidence he has presented suggests that many organisms possess a kind of pre-programmed adaptive capacity. A capacity that Shapiro has described as operating under algorithmic control. Yet, it remains still unexplained how the information inherent in such algorithmic control, or pre-programmed capacity, might have originated. Thus, the big picture conclusion is that evolutionary processes are only capable of driving changes at the level of species and genera, but not at the level of families or higher. Stated differently, evolution produces a limited number of changes, and then no further significant change is possible. How life evolved remains yet a mystery. There's no mechanism that could produce the complex coordinated changes that building new functional body parts or some significant features requires. The question of origin and evolution of life seems to be ultimately a question of the origin of complex biological information. Do you know any other way to generate meaningful and functional information other than intelligent conscious mind? You don't, because no one does. It is mankind's common and repeated experience that functional and meaningful information comes only from a mind. This is Steve Adler of Art, Science and Truth. Thank you for watching.